Hi everyone, today we'll talk about the carbon cycle, and this is the document that you'll need. The only thing you really have to fill out is the missing words down here when we go through the cycle itself, and then you have some info about the game here, which we'll talk about after, as well as human activities that affect the carbon cycle. First, let's just go through the presentation. As you probably already know from the chemistry unit, carbon is an element on the periodic table. Specifically, it's in group 14 and it's a nonmetal. And one thing about carbon is that it can bond to other groups. For example, carbon can bond to oxygen and it can therefore make CO2 or carbon dioxide. Another important thing to know about carbon is that it's the basic building block of life. A fun fact about carbon is that it allows us to determine the age of an object. So, let's say you're digging a hole one day and suddenly you find a large bone. You could perform this test, which is called carbon dating, to examine how much carbon is in the bone. And essentially, when there's a small amount of carbon, this means that the bone has been there a very long time. So that animal passed away a very long time ago. However, if there is a lot of carbon in it, then it would have passed away more recently and therefore it is younger. Something else we know about carbon is that we humans breathe out carbon dioxide. Increasing amounts of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere are responsible for global warming. You'll look more into that at the end of the lesson. Now let's look at the cycle. So in the carbon cycle, carbon moves between the abiotic and biotic parts of an ecosystem. So as we remember, abiotic means non-living, biotic means living things. And most of Earth's carbon is actually not cycled because it's stored in what we call carbon-rich deposits in the soil. Examples of these carbon-rich deposits include fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. At the beginning of the carbon cycle, this producer and other plants will absorb carbon from the atmosphere because they use it for what we call photosynthesis. We'll look more into photosynthesis later on. As you know from the food chain and food web lesson, a herbivore will then consume producers, such as leaves from this tree, and that means that the carbon will get bioaccumulated into their body, and that will continue throughout the food chain as carnivores eat the herbivore and other top carnivores eat those carnivores. When this sheep, for example, dies, what happens is its waste products will remain in the soil and some of the carbon will continue throughout the cycle and be released back into the atmosphere. However, in the fourth step, some of the carbon is not released back into the atmosphere and it becomes what we call fossil fuels. As you saw earlier in the beginning of the lesson, it's one of those carbon-rich deposits which are cycled sometimes, but not often. Most of this depends on man-made activities, such as boating, driving, any of that, because we humans use these fossil fuels in order to fuel our vehicles, for example. And when we do that, when we're burning these fossil fuels, that releases carbon back into the atmosphere. So now you have a little idea of how human activities increase the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. But one thing that this is causing is climate change, and that's very important because climate change can alter the most critical abiotic factors in the ecosystem, such as temperature and water availability. And when we saw in the population changes lesson that temperature is really important for ecosystems because every species has their own tolerance range. And sometimes if it's too hot, then they won't survive. Too cold, they won't survive. So that is really important that we maintain temperatures that species can live in and as well as thrive in because we don't want the populations too low, too high. They really have to find that balance. Climate change can also be responsible for small amounts of rainfall combined with high temperatures, and this affects water availability, which is not a good thing at all because producers they require this water to grow and then they serve as food for the herbivores who are eaten by the carnivores or eaten by the top carnivores. But if these herbivores don't have enough food available to them, then this will have consequences on the whole food chain and on the ecosystem as a whole. In areas where there are glaciers, high temperatures will cause glaciers to melt, and then this will in turn increase sea levels. This has consequences on producers such as algae, and this is because the light penetration becomes more difficult when you have a deeper level of water. So the light has to go through a lot more water than it did before. Therefore, less light is reaching the algae. All right, so now what you'll do, now that you had a little introduction on human activity and the carbon cycle, you will play this carbon cycle game. So this is what it looks like. So here you're a carbon atom and you go through all of these different stations. You can choose which direction you want to go and you'll run into some questions which will be great practice for when you will be doing your quiz. And after that, you will just answer these questions, give a few examples of human activities that increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then you'll give the opposite, so activities that decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and then we're just going to share our answers during the next Google Meet. That's all for the carbon cycle. Next, we'll talk about photosynthesis and cellular respiration. Thank you.